All right, folks, we are just at the top of the hour, so it's 9 a.m. Irish time, so we will kick things off. Hello, and thanks for joining us this morning, or this afternoon, or this evening, depending on where you're logging in from. And welcome to today's webinar on adopting a design-first approach to API development with SwaggerHub. So thanks for joining us. Maybe if people want to let us know in the chat, just let us know where you're logging in from. That could be interesting. I know there's probably a lot of us maybe working from home or maybe working in slightly different environment than we normally would, what with everything that's going on. So hopefully everybody's keeping safe and looking after themselves. So for the next 30-45 minutes, we'll take a short break from all of that for something completely different and talk about design first with SwaggerHub. So your hosts for today, that's me on the right hand side. My name is Joe Joyce and I'm a solutions engineer with SmartBear, and I'm joined by my colleague Adrian Minnick. Adrian, can you hear me all right?
I can indeed. Hi everybody. Nice to meet a lot of people from, just looking at the chat section, from all over the world actually at the moment.
This is fantastic. No, good to see everybody from a lot of different locations, and hopefully, like we said, you're all keeping well. So we'll be your hosts for today's session. So we'll do a brief introduction first of all. So first things first, who are we? Who are SmartBear? Chances are, if you're joining this webinar, you're probably familiar with SmartBear in some way, shape, or form, even whether you realize it or not. But we're a software company, and we provide tools for development, testing, and operations teams to help them with their software development and their testing. You can see some numbers about us there. More importantly, on the right-hand side, you can see some of our tools. So these are probably the words you might recognize. Obviously we're here to talk about SwaggerHub today. We also have SoapUI Pro and Test Complete, a couple of other tools there, and we'll take a closer look at them now. And because we're a tool company, that's probably how you know us best. And you can see from this slide here, we have tools that slot in a variety of different parts of the SDLC. Our deepest kind of pillar, if you want, is there in testing. And so if the top half is UI testing and the bottom half is API testing, we've got quite a bit going on there. Probably two of our best known tools would be Test Complete, which is our automated UI functional testing tool, and SoapUI Pro, which is our automated API functional and security testing tool. But we have a lot of other tools there, as you can see, and over on the design side, we have a bit of a footprint there as well. Cucumber Studio is a tool you can use for designing features and tests using BDD. So that's kind of a new tool, very exciting. And we also have SwaggerHub, which is why we're here today, which is a tool for designing, modeling, and sharing API definitions for your REST APIs. So that's what we will be talking about today. So we always have an agenda. Let's talk about the agenda. So here's what we're going to discuss today. So first of all, we're going to talk a little bit about the differences between design first and code first. So there are obviously two important topics for just given what we'll be discussing today. So we'll take a look at each approach and talk about some of the differences between the two of them. Then we'll talk about some of the challenges that go with a code first approach. So a bit about getting stakeholders involved in the software development process as early as possible, and maybe difficulties you could have standardizing in a code first approach. And then finally, we will take a look at how SwaggerHub, our API design platform, can help with some of those challenges. So as always, if anybody does have any questions, geez, we have a lot of people joining today, Adrian, all around the world.
I know. I actually, there's
I'm shocked.
the amount. There's people from Europe, Australia, New Zealand, Africa. My God, I'm in shock.
Yeah. No, well, again, it's great to see people on the line. I know a lot of us are probably working remotely now, so good to have a bit of a digital get together. So we'll get straight to it. And as you said in the agenda, one of the first things we want to talk about is the differences between design first and code first. So myself and Adrian, like we said, we work on the solutions engineering team at SmartBear. So we would spend a lot of our time having conversations with testing teams, development teams, API teams, and trying to help them understand, can any of our solutions help them do something a little bit better, help solve a problem that they have. And when it comes to SwaggerHub, a lot of those conversations revolve around the idea of design first and code first when it comes to API development. So the clues in the name with both approaches. So if you're designing an API, if you're developing an API rather, and you're using a design first approach, the idea is that the very first thing that happens in the process is collaboration on the design of the API definition. Now that could be, everyone getting together on a Zoom call to talk about the design. There might be an artifact that comes out of that, like an actual, schema or a definition file, like in JSON or YAML. But the idea is that implementation doesn't start until everybody has agreed on the design, which is generally, it's a good practice with any kind of software development, especially when it comes to APIs. So broadly speaking, what will happen is an opportunity or a requirement will be identified for either a new API or new functionality for an existing API. So that might be, it could be a Jira ticket is created, it could be a couple of emails, like we said, it could be a meeting or something like that. The important thing is the requirement emerges, and the first thing that happens is design. And the important thing is that, the analogy that we use a lot of the time is, if you're building a house, you wouldn't start building a house until you had, some kind of blueprint. You wouldn't build a house without a blueprint, because, or else first of all, how are you going to know what actually has to be built? And how are you going to know when you're done? How are you going to know that you've designed the API correctly if you don't have some kind of guide that's laying out what the actual functional requirements for the API are? And that's one of the main advantages of design first. First of all, is that it makes sense to have that kind of reference point for development teams and testing teams, so that everybody knows, at least at a high level, what the implementation is supposed to look like. And it makes sense, right? I suppose the important thing with a session like this, and we try and get this across in our conversations too, is that, it's not like one is right and one is wrong. It's not like you should always use design first and you should never use code first. Right? There's always going to be scenarios where one of those approaches will make more sense than the other. Generally what we see, we ran, some of you might have seen our State of the API report in the last couple of months, and basically involved us polling a large number of developers and testers and various API practitioners, just to understand what challenges they were facing and how their API design and development was going. And one of the big things that we saw was that as teams grew, and as the size of the organization in question grew, and obviously therefore the budget that teams had available to them and the people that teams had available to them became larger, then design first became the preferable approach. Right? So it obviously means you would have the luxury of a little bit of time to sit down and think about what the functionality needs to be. Whereas at a smaller outfit, a smaller organization or smaller team, you might not have that luxury, right? The most important thing might be, listen, we need to get something out there to our users. We need to get functionality out there quick. There might be pressure coming from on top. We don't really have time to sit around talking about the design, talking about the definition, right? So it's the best one in the world. There's times when a code first approach might make more sense. And it could be something like that, or it could be that you may be in an industry, that is maybe more tolerant of risk, right? So if you're in code first, you might be a startup, and maybe it's like some consumer technology or an app or a game or something like that. Something where the risk of implementation not matching specification might not be that high, right? So that if you release code fast, you want to get features out there, get feedback quick, there's the expectation that maybe functionality of the API as a service isn't going to be perfect straight away. So that's fine. Whereas obviously in other less risk tolerant industries, design first makes a lot of sense. So I've kind of given away the slide already, but we probably all would have guessed. Again, the clue is in the name. Code first, then developers build the API first, and they'll generate their open API documents from their code. So this is the example we talked about a second ago. So, the requirement comes in, and straight from the off, the first activity that happens is development, right? You're actually writing the API, you're implementing endpoints, you're developing resources, building resources, that kind of a thing. And there was a word there in that last slide that we probably haven't fully defined yet. So take a second just to define that. Some of you are probably already familiar with it, but just so everybody is on the same page, we referenced an open API definition. So an open API, or the open API specification, is it's a guide, it's a syntax guide for how you can write open API definitions, right? So an open API definition is just a JSON or a YAML file that describes the functionality of your API. So again, that's kind of why we're all here. You use the open API specification to write open API definitions. And the open API specification, once upon a time, it was called Swagger specification. SmartBear owned it, and over time donated it to the open source community, and it became the Open API specification, or OAS. So we're on OAS 3.0 at the moment. So you use the OAS to write open API definitions, and then from an open API definition, you will use that as a guide to actually developing and implementing your RESTful API. So in that slide, we referenced the code first approach, right? And we said that you might write the code first and then generate your open API definition from the code. So that's always an option, right? There's a couple of ways you can do that. Like the goal or the endpoint is that you have an open API definition that you can use as a reference point. And without having to go through the code, you can look at the open API definition and say, okay, this is what the API is doing. These are the inputs I need to provide to it, and these are the responses that I would get. And you do that in a couple of different ways. There are Swagger annotation libraries. So there's annotation you can add to your code base that will generate an open API definition for you. There's a tool called Swagger Inspector you can use to query endpoints that are running somewhere, and you'll have an open API definition and generate it from that. So there's a few ways to approach that. But the main thing is that in the code first approach, code comes first. You generate the API definition kind of retrospectively. So again, like you said, just to kind of reiterate, there's always going to be scenarios where a code first approach makes more sense, or maybe just has to be what is done due to certain constraints. One of the main differences or between code first and design first, and probably one of the main weaknesses of code first, is that you can miss out on valuable upfront discussion with key stakeholders. So, the way the kind of the tech environment looks now, and the way the API economy, we talk a lot about the API economy looks, the stakeholders of an API development project are not just developers anymore. So obviously they're key stakeholders, right? We wouldn't be here without the developers. We need developers to actually write the API, build the API, and also then actually consume it. So the developers are also going to be the customer or the end user of the API, right? There's no point, if you're writing a public facing API, more than likely you're going to want people to actually use it, right, for it to become valuable. But they're not the only stakeholders, right? So you also have, again, depending on the industry that you're in, you might have project managers, business analysts. We do a lot of work with fintech companies, and you're going to need people with the business head to help guide, what the functionality of the API is going to be, what does it actually need to do. Also to help with understanding, what do we have to, from maybe a legal perspective, or from a kind of guideline perspective, what do we have to make sure that it doesn't do, maybe? Or this is kind of when we talk about standardization. If you're in a heavily regulated industry, there may be some ISO standards or kind of legal standards that you have to make sure your API complies with, right? And you might not have, a developer might not necessarily have that industry experience. So you might need to have a more business focused head looking at that. So that's one thing that you miss out on with code first, right? Is because, again, losing the name, code first, you're working, developers really are going to be the main people involved very early on, right? So there's quite that steep learning curve where if you're not comfortable doing code reviews, if you're not writing the actual application code, then you're probably not going to be contributing to the design of the API up front. And that's something you get with design first. So you can see a couple of other risks involved with code first here. So the first one there, it's costly to build the wrong thing. So upfront design encourages discussions that lead to better developer experience. So we kind of talked about that a little bit a second ago. You know, again, anyone who maybe has joined more than one or two SmartBear webinars before, you've probably seen that graph where we talk about the cost of fixing a bug, kind of with respect to at what point in the software development lifecycle it's found. So in general, rule of thumb, the earlier you find the bug, the cheaper it's going to be to fix it, right? So if you know, and I don't just mean finding bugs in the code, like you could be sitting around a table with developers and stakeholders and project managers and discussing what the functionality of the API is going to be, and you might have been going down one track with one piece of functionality and then realize, oh, actually we can't have it doing that because this breaks that rule or that's unexpected functionality, right? You know, the only real cost there is time. So you've very, very cheap to fix that. Obviously then the further along with the development you go, and if you're in code first, obviously you're starting straight away with the development, then it's going to be more costly to fix that bug, right? So if you're going to need someone to actually go through the code and refactor, make changes, that kind of a thing. So the second risk there, it's harder to build consistent APIs across many teams. Early discussion and standardization tools can promote a consistent style and feel across APIs. So what do we mean by that? What we mean by that is, you know, and to kind of maybe start talking a little bit more specifically about SwaggerHub, when you start, so maybe take 2 or 3 steps back. So I talked about the Open API specification earlier, right? And that's kind of the foundation of all of this. If you're developing RESTful APIs and you want to have a definition, you know, it may make sense to look at OAS and look at Swagger and look at that ecosystem of tools, right? If you're a kind of small scale team or an individual developer, then you might be able to use some of the open source tools, right? So there's a very, very useful open source community and open source ecosystem of tools built around OAS. You have like Swagger Editor, Swagger CodeGen, and Swagger UI, to name 3. And they are open source tools that let you make more sophisticated use of your Open API definition, right? So sorry, actually, I'm slightly distracted by some of the chats there, so it makes sense to just highlight this, because forgive me, I forgot to highlight this at the start. There's a few questions popping up there about this being recorded. So yes, this is being recorded. This is also live. So I am here now. Hello, everyone. Any questions? Be sure and pop them into the Q&A. But yes, this is being recorded, so you will all receive a recording of this session in about 24 hours once this is complete. So yeah, forgive me, should have highlighted that up front. But yeah, you'll get the recording and the presentation. So yeah, happy to clarify that. So to go back to my original point, the open source tools are very useful for smaller teams, right, or individual developers. But when it starts to scale up, when you start to have many developers, many teams across different business units, for example, you know, writing your APIs, then standardization can become an issue, right? Because if you know, if a developer or developers are the end users or the customers or consumers of your APIs, we want to make it as easy as possible for developers to just pick up your APIs and start using them, right? And so for that to happen, you know, if I have a company called Joe's Bank, and Joe's Bank has, you know, 50 different APIs that I expose to my end users, but 5 of them will behave in a certain way, and 5 of them will handle XML in one way, and another 5 of them will handle XML in another different way. That's not a great user experience for developers, right? Because you would expect that if if these APIs are being developed by the same organization and being released by the same organization, they're going to handle these things in a similar way, which obviously becomes tricky once you start to bring more teams and more people into it. So that's what standardization is, and when we're looking at the demo of SwaggerHub in a few minutes' time, we'll talk about that more specifically and how SwaggerHub does that. And final risk of code first, which we've kind of alluded to as well, is it's easier to treat the API as less than a product, right? So what that means is, design first brings in the more business-focused users and stakeholders from the get-go, right? So the people who might be more likely to view the API as as a product, right? Pretty much. Whereas if your goal is to expose APIs and services, you have a lot of useful services internal to your organization, and you want to monetize them and expose them. Then they are essentially products, right? So you might want to have input from someone who has that product head, and who's going to be able to think about what it needs to behave like for it to be, a successful product that people actually want to use. With code first, again, you're excluding those voices from the conversation potentially until a little bit later on in the process, when it might be more difficult to bring in their recommendations and bring in their approaches, right? So with a design first approach, it's very easy for non-coders to sit down and contribute their equally valuable kind of product focused ideas, and back and forth with the developers. And then once the time comes, that's all been taken on board, and the developers are actually implementing the APIs based on that type of feedback, as well as their technical input. So how can SwaggerHub help? The elephant in the room. We're here to talk about a SmartBear platform, which is SwaggerHub. And as Adrian is going to show us now, SwaggerHub can help tackle a couple of the points that we mentioned here in a few different ways. You can see a couple of them listed out here, but I think without further ado, it makes sense to actually, a picture speaks 1,000 words. We'll take a look at them in action and hopefully understand them a little bit better. So with that said, Adrian, I'm going to stop my share now, and I will pass the screen over to you.
Perfect. Thanks, Joe. So I'm just going to share my screen here. Perfect. So once again, I'll just ask if everyone can just, or some people can just pop in the chat section just to make sure you can see my screen and hear me okay. Okay, yeah, everything seems to be good so far. Yeah, so as Joe mentioned, SwaggerHub is a design and documentation tool, and its power is really with regards a design first approach. So enabling organizations or companies to implement a design first approach, have the collaboration between different team members, add in the layer of, let's say, standardization, and then just be able to create and maintain those API definitions. So I suppose with regards Swagger and SwaggerHub, I think Joe mentioned it earlier, but SwaggerHub consists, or it consumes the open source Swagger tools. So there's a number of those tools available, the Swagger editor, the Swagger UI, and Swagger CodeGen. And then it also adds a layer of standardization and collaboration. So is anybody actually using any of the open source Swagger tools? So feel free just to pop into the chat section if you're using any of the open source tools at the moment. Okay, and just let me know what tools you're actually using, whether it's the UI or the editor. Okay, so it seems to be a mixture at the moment. Okay, yeah, the Swagger UI seems to be the most common one, and this would reflect what I would come across at conferences or on calls. So from here, what we can talk about is I'll be able to give you just a quick run through of the tool, how we can generate a new API definition, then how we can have the collaboration, we can build out our definition, have that collaboration or feedback loop, and then we can version the API definition, and from there we can integrate with source control tools. So from here, this is the My Hub screen, or the landing page, and within SwaggerHub, this will allow you to view all of the API definitions that we've created and cataloged. Now, from here, I'm just going to show you very quickly how we can create a new API definition. So on the left-hand side of the screen, we can select Create. And we can see here that we can create a new API definition, and we can also import an API definition. So potentially, If you are using some of the open source tools, or you're using a code first approach and you are generating a definition after the code, you can import the JSON or YAML file here. Now, I'm just going to create a new API definition. We can see here we have a screen that will just allow us to populate the version of the Open API. So whether it's going to be 2.0 or 3.0. We can select and use templates if we want. So we have some predefined templates available here. Now I'm just going to select a pet store template. So this is a good starting point for anybody who's just beginning to use SwaggerHub or isn't familiar with, let's say, a design first approach or generating that YAML documentation. So I'm just going to give it a name here. So I'll give it sample pet store 1. And then from here, we define where we want this to be stored or cataloged in SwaggerHub. So we can select the organization and we can select a project folder. Now I'm going to touch on these a bit more after we have a quick run through, but we can select our project folder here. And now we have the concept of the visibility. So whether we want to make our API definitions private or public within SwaggerHub. So with this visibility here, if we select public, it means that this API definition is going to be available to anybody who accesses SwaggerHub. So they'd be able to access SwaggerHub, search for it, and view it. Now, if we want to have restricted access, so potentially we might want to have this for internal use only, or potentially some external consumers, but we still want to have restricted access, we would then select private. When we create the API definition now, we're now on the design screen. So this is where the designer or developer will spend the majority of their time. So in the middle of the screen here, we have the code editor. This will allow your designer to build out the API definition. And this is essentially, as Joe mentioned earlier, the blueprint for your API. So you're going to be defining here all of the methods, the operations, parameters, responses, all of that information will be defined here within the code editor. So this will allow the designer to build out the definition in YAML. And as they're building out this definition here, the documentation section on the right-hand side will be automatically generated for us. So this is automatically generated in real time. And if we add in a new method here, this would be incorporated into our documentation. Now, for any designers or anybody that's looking to implement this, there is a syntax validator here. And this can be quite useful as anytime your designer is building out an API definition or they're adding new functionality, if there is any errors within the syntax, the designer will be alerted to this here. It'll tell them the line and the description. So it just helps reduce, let's say, finding errors later on as we're, let's say, trying to import this into another tool. We can identify these errors at a very early stage in the design process. Now, one of the key points within how to use SwaggerHub for a design first approach was the ability to use the auto mocking feature within SwaggerHub. And we can take a look at this now. So from here, when we open up one of our operations, we can try the auto mocking and the try it out button here. This will allow us to enter in a value here, send a request, and receive a sample response. So we can enter in a value, we can execute this, and we can receive our static response here. So this is a response we would have defined within our definition. but it's a good way of allowing consumers to view how the response is going to be returned, or the format of that response. Okay, so we've had a look here at how to create an API definition and how the documentation is automatically generated for us. But I suppose if we want to have just a quick run through of being able to add a collaborator and look at that collaboration cycle. So from here on the design screen, potentially we could have one person designing or creating this API definition, but we might want to have two people reviewing this. So in order to add people to review an API definition, we can select the collaboration section here. We can enter in and we can invite either a member or a team to collaborate. So we can provide them with different permissions. And then once we've invited collaborators, they'd be able to review the API definition here. They can leave comments. So for instance, if they see a summary here that needs to be updated or an operation ID, they can select the plus icon on the left-hand side. They can add comments here. So we can enter in change ID. We can leave this comment and we can now see we have an open comment available. So we can tag members if we want, team members. We can also have notifications set up for this so that if our API definition is, let's say, published or a new version is created, our team members will receive notifications. But from here, our designer will be able to come in, they'll be able to view a list of open comments, potential changes that they might need to make. And this leads back to Joe's comment earlier on with making those changes at an earlier stage. So rather than having to implement changes once we have, let's say, written our code, we can now update our API definition here. We could change any of the information. Then the designer would be able to come back in here, reply to this comment, and resolve it. And we can now see that moved into a resolved comment section. So this is the collaboration section. It just means that all the collaboration for each version is stored here within the actual API definition or within the platform itself. Now, once we've gone through the collaboration, everything, our API definition is now ready for development. We can now create a new version. So we could enter in a version number here. And we now have created a new version. So this will be one of the main pain points with regards creating new versions of API definitions and maintaining those versions. So all of this is done within SwaggerHub. We can view our previous versions, and we can also publish a version here as well within SwaggerHub, which just makes it a read-only version. So that if you don't want any changes to be made to this version while it's going through development, we can make it a read-only version. And then from there, we would, if we want to implement new changes, we would just create a new version and add the functionality in. So we've now created our API definition, we've had our collaboration, and we've been able to create new versions. But with regards our definitions now, if we want to improve or help to create a more efficient development of the APIs and testing, we can use the code generation part. So I could see that some people are familiar or are using the open source code gen section, but within SwaggerHub here, we can actually set up integrations. So we can set up integrations here with API gateways, and we also have a list of source control tools. So we can set up our integrations with these. So potentially if you want to have server stubs or client SDKs or the API definition itself pushed to source control, you can set up any of these integrations here, and then you can push your code or your definitions to the source control every time you save or publish your API definition. So this enables a faster and more efficient approach to your testing and your development. The fact that you're able to push all of this to source control or to an API gateway and maintain it. Now, another key area that we talked about was the ability to standardize the API definitions. And I believe one of the first questions that we received today was with regards a 200 response, and if this is going to be spread across several files. So I'm just going to touch on the standardization aspect now within SwaggerHub. So there's two main approaches or two main elements to this. So first of all, we have the concept of domains. And you might have seen these here at the top of the screen. So we can create a domain and we can store it here, similar to our API definitions. But a domain works as a library of common components. So it would allow us, for example, to document our 200 response, which is going to be common throughout all of our APIs or a large list of our APIs. So we can document that once within a domain, and then from there we can reference that throughout our API definitions. So it means that we get a lot of reusability from this. We don't have to enter in that response every time into our API definitions. We just enter in, we just document that once, and then we can reference that. If anything changes within that response, so for instance, if the description changes or the message, rather than having to update that in all of our definitions, we can update that once within a domain, and then we can reference, or that'll be updated throughout all of the API definitions. So domains allow users to build out a library of common components, and this means that we get a large, we have a lot of reusability throughout the tool. Now, the other aspect with regards to standardization is the ability to create those design rules, which helps with the API governance. So at the moment, for anybody, let's say for everyone that's listening, is there certain approaches or certain design rules that you're looking to implement? Or does anybody have any, let's say, API design rules that they want to incorporate going forward? So we would see some users that might have a list of these design rules that they want to implement. A lot of other users might be looking to start creating these as they get more familiar with a design first approach. So with regards our design first, or using the standardization in a design first approach, we can see here at the organization level, we have a list of predefined design rules. So for instance, here I have one selected, and it means that the API title, so every API definition under this organization must contain a title, and it can't be empty. So it must contain a string. So we can add these rules here, any of these that we want. So we can see we have a list of predefined or out of the box rules, but we also have the ability to add in our own custom rules as well. So from here, we can add in the name of our custom rule. We can enter in the path. So if we want to just check for the existence of a path, we can select that here. But if we want to check for specific content or elements throughout our API definition, we can use the regex expressions here to match. And then we can select the severity of our rule, whether it's going to be a blocker and stop us from publishing, or whether it's just going to be a warning. We enter in our message, and then we can actually test this out here by selecting an API definition in our organization. And if we just actually remove this here, we can see that it's working in real time, showing us how our rules, our custom rules, are going to be implemented. So this allows us to build out, let's say, a library of our own custom rules, design rules for our API governance. And then we can implement that throughout our organization. So we've gone through now how to create an API definition, how we can version it, have the collaboration, and add that layer of standardization to it. I suppose one last thing that I just want to show is with regards to structure. We showed how we can catalog our API definitions. So we have an organization here, and we have projects, and we can also add teams and members to those. So with regards how we catalog our API definitions, if we want to have restricted access for some project folders for specific teams, we can do that. We can create multiple teams within an organization. And then we can add members in different roles. So whether we want to add members who just are going to be able to view the API definitions and consume them, whether they're going to be able to collaborate, add those comments, and edit the definitions, or whether they're going to have owner access and be able to perform some administrative tasks as well. So we can create our teams, add our members in the different roles to those teams, and then we can assign them to an organization or to the projects, depending on however you want to structure your SwaggerHub instance. So it just shows you, it gives you the permissions to configure it and to set up and replicate your structure within your organization. So I suppose that's all that I have for the moment. I hope it's been helpful. So I suppose, Joe, is there any questions relating to the tool itself, or any interesting questions coming through?
Yes, so there's a few things. One or two questions have come up around users who might want to contribute but not write YAML. So yeah, the thing there is, the short answer is yes. So there is a GUI that you can use if you are, a business stakeholder or whatever term you want to use. It's the visual editor. So if you go into the workspace in the Swagger editor view, there is a GUI that you can use to add information about resources and about the API itself without having to, without having to write the YAML. So that's kind of how we address what we talked about earlier in terms of, you don't necessarily need to be a developer or be comfortable writing code. You don't even necessarily need to be, a YAML expert either. So while I'm just going through these questions, one thing I just want to do while we're kind of wrapping up is I'm just going to launch a very quick poll, and it would be very helpful if anybody, if anyone wants to hear a little bit more about SwaggerHub. I know there was a lot of good questions. There were some more specific questions that would probably be better suited to maybe a slightly longer call with either myself or Adrian or one of the other members of the SE team, and we'd be happy to help with that. So I've just launched a poll there now, and if anybody who's interested could answer, that'd be very helpful. But while we're at that, just to take a look at some of the other questions. So the question about standardization rules being backwards compatible. So if you have standardization rules set up and you import an API definition that was maybe generated from code or written outside of SwaggerHub, then you're going to be able to run those rules against it. So even if you've written the definition itself somewhere where those rules weren't available, you're still going to be able to run them within SwaggerHub. So
Apologies, I was actually on mute talking to myself there, but I can see a question coming through here about the, let's say, the code gen and being able to implement that with custom frameworks. So I suppose one thing that I didn't touch on there is the fact that we do have an API available for SwaggerHub as well. So potentially, if you do want to integrate with an application or an in-house framework that isn't listed or that's not going to be listed on our integrations, you would be able to use potentially the webhooks integration and the registry API for SwaggerHub.
no, that's exactly right. It looks like might be some issues, people viewing the poll. Adrian, can you see the poll from your end?
I'll just check. I'm not sure. No, I'm just going to try and launch. I'll try and launch it here.
Yeah, would you mind? It seems like I can see it, but nobody else can see it. One person has answered anyway, so one person can see it, so that's good. While you're doing that, I'll just go on. Yeah.
Yeah. No, it's not launching here on my side.
We were doing okay there. We got about 46 minutes into our first webinar remotely without any technical hitches. So
something was bound to happen.
It was bound to go wrong. Yeah. It's inside. Yeah. So there's a question there. Is it inside Zoom? So it'll be in your Zoom interface. Again, let me know if you cannot see that. I'd be interested to know who could see it. Who is that one person who could see it? How did they figure it out? I'm just going to see if I end the poll and I'll relaunch it.
Okay, yeah, I think I can see it now.
You see it now?
Yeah, we'll see. We'll know it more. Yeah.
Now, look at that. Turning it off and on again never fails.
And thank you to that one person who's probably answered twice now.
Yeah, appreciate it. No, so thanks for that. And again, look, if you don't want to hear any more, that's absolutely fine. If you do, by all means, answer yes, and we can set up a call. Let me just have a scan through some more of these questions. There was a question up towards the top. No, so Martin had a good question, and it's very relevant. Martin said, you mentioned earlier that implementation doesn't start until people have agreed on the design. We have a constant debate about being agile. If I would say the above in our development organization, a lot of people would intensely disagree and say that this is a waterfall method. How would you respond to that? I can see exactly what you mean. So I suppose the way that I look at it, and again, I suppose agile and as with, unfortunately, as with a lot of things in software development, you know, if you have 20 engineers in a room together and you ask them what something means, you'll get 25 different answers. So it is a little bit open for interpretation, but how I would respond to that, and it is a valid point, is that you're shifting testing left, right? Or you're shifting left some of the processes that would usually happen later on in the life cycle, right? So like we talked about earlier, you're finding potential issues with the API earlier. So before any code is written. So you're potentially involving, you're involving the testers and you're involving the business stakeholders. You're involving the people who would know what those errors and bugs are earlier in the process. Which to my mind is a good thing. It's, you're maybe investing a little bit more time up front, but then that is going to result in time saved when it comes to development and testing, right? So if, I know, again, agile is one of these words where, everyone will disagree on what it actually means, but if we take it fairly literally and think about it in terms of speed, if you have a detailed and kind of comprehensive definition up front, obviously that takes a little bit more of investment of time. But, as we saw earlier, you can then use that definition to generate code and get your development started faster, right? You can also take that definition and use it with something like SOAP UI Pro and generate test cases from it, right? So you're saving time further down the line, and then, ideally in a happy path scenario, that is going to it's going to result in software getting released faster, features getting out there faster. Ideal scenario. Obviously, you know, there's always going to be challenges along the way. But I mean, that's a good question. It's a very good question. And obviously, spending a lot of time in the design phase is probably something more maybe akin to waterfall. Yeah, I mean, Alan's made a good point there in the questions. Agile does not necessarily mean no design. You still need to know what or how your feature should work. So yeah, it's a good point, you know. And again, the better that you know how your features are supposed to eventually work, then potentially the faster people are actually going to be able to write them. There's a couple of people asking for more information about the code gen tool. So the code generators they're developed in the open source community, and then SwaggerHub kind of consumes that. So if you search Swagger code gen, you'll find most of those libraries up on GitHub, and you can have a look and a poke around if you want, so just to kind of understand how they work a little bit better and what they actually generate and how they work. So definitely just have a look on GitHub for those. So again, a lot of questions, a lot of very good questions coming in, and I know it's a cliche to say it. Unfortunately, we just don't have time to cover them all, but that's something that we could do for you on a slightly longer call or a more focused call if you wanted to set something up. Is there support for mocking API? Is there support for mocking API responses until real implementation is finished for testing purposes? So there is, to a certain extent. That would be the auto mocking feature in SwaggerHub. The auto mocking integration will give you a simulated response. Within SwaggerHub, it'll just give you a simulated 200 response. SmartBear does have a tool called Service V that does a little bit more advanced mocking than that. So if you're interested in, you know, if mocking is a big part of your requirements, I would say have a look, Google Service V, SmartBear, and have a look, and that could be interesting for you. Can you validate an implementation against a schema with SwaggerHub? So no, not necessarily just within SwaggerHub. That would usually require, it would require another tool. So SwaggerHub isn't a functional testing tool really. It's a design tool, right? So it's a design tool, but like we talked about earlier, you can take that open API definition. SmartBear, as you saw in those first couple of slides, we have a tool called SoapUI Pro, which is a functional API testing tool. And that can take an open API definition. You import that into SoapUI Pro from SwaggerHub, and it creates test cases for you that you can then use to test implementation against specification, right? So you take the definition, bring it into SoapUI Pro, and then start running tests against the real endpoints, and then ideally what you have in implementation will match what you imported. So it's 9:53.
Yeah, I was just going to say there, Joe, just one last one, a very quick one to answer is, I can see one question just asking, is there an on-premise version of SwaggerHub? So just to let you know, there is a SaaS version, but there also is an on-premise version of SwaggerHub as well. So depending on your needs, if you need to have that installed on-premise, there is that capability there. Perfect. So I think as you were just about to mention, Joe, it's coming up to 9:53 here in Ireland anyway. So yeah, we've run a bit over, but once again, I just like to thank everyone. There was great interaction there today as well. So thanks everybody for joining. You know, it was from all over the world, which is good to see this morning. But yeah, from me, just thanks. If you do want more information, just feel free to contact us, and we'll be able to go through, as Joe mentioned, we can go through a personalized demo in a bit more detail. And any questions that you have, we'll be able to go through those on the demo with you.
Yeah, for sure. And there's a couple of people asking for a little bit more on code gen. So yeah, like I said, this is kind of more an overview of the design first approach, with maybe just as much on the code gen side of things. But like you said, if you go on to smartbear.com and have a look for SwaggerHub, we have plenty of resources on code gen, and as well as there being plenty of resources in the open source as well. If you want to see a little bit more about that. But no, that's good feedback, and we certainly might do another webinar in future that focuses more so specifically on CodeGen and how to use it, because it's a very big and useful part of design for us with SwaggerHub. So yeah, look, Adrian, thank you very much for the demo. Really appreciate it. Very good session. And again, just to repeat, Adrian, thanks everyone for joining. Really appreciate it. Have a great week, and we'll hopefully see you again soon.
Perfect. Thanks, everybody.